Thank you for joining the Holocaust Center for Humanities Lunch and Learn program. I am Alana Cohn-Kennedy, the Chief Operating Officer at the Holocaust Center. While people are joining, please take a moment to let us know from where you are joining in the chat. At the Holocaust Center, we build courageous communities by teaching and honoring the history, stories, and lessons of the Holocaust. Across the state of Washington, we work with teachers and students and learners of all ages to empower individuals to recognize that their actions, even the small ones, can make a difference. The Holocaust Center for Humanity is located in downtown Seattle, just a few blocks away from the famous Pike Place Market. If you haven't been to the Holocaust Center before, I'd like to invite you to come and visit. Join us on the first Thursday evening of each month for Free First Thursday, where you can explore the exhibits, ask questions of knowledgeable guides on hand, and drink a glass of wine. In honor of Pride Month in June, we have a special presentation at Free First Thursday entitled Finding Pride, Queer Legacies of the Holocaust with our museum coordinator, Michael Langberg. Register ahead of time or just walk in. That's on the evening of June 6th. We have two additional upcoming programs at the Holocaust Center. The first, on May 21st, we have a special workshop on easing generational trauma. And on May 23rd, our Ambassadors for Change group is hosting a challenging and enlightening panel discussion on identifying and confronting misinformation. We have many lawyers and legal professionals tuning into the program today. Lawyers, you can earn 1 CLE credit for attending today. To earn the credit, you will need to complete the survey, which will be shared at the end of the program. That's the important information. For the CLE credit, you must complete the survey, which will be shared at the end of the program. I'll post a link in the chat, and we'll let you all know once the link is posted. I want to thank our legal committee for helping to plan today's program. Mark Bowman, Kathy Feldman, Maria Hodgins, Lucas Michaels, Jay Rifkin, Sabina Shapiro, Rob Spitzer, Jeremy Wood, and Ron Friedman, who wears many hats at the Holocaust Center, including as a member of our Speakers Bureau, where he shares his father's story of survival and is on our board of directors. Ron, thank you so much for all of your work in support of Holocaust education and the Holocaust Center over so many years. I'll turn it over to you now to introduce our main presenter for today.
All right, it's great to be with everyone. It's an honor to introduce the speaker today. It can be said that life is filled with irony, and the story of how this event came to be is in January of this year. I became aware of a podcast put out by Tablet called Covering Their Tracks, which tells the story of the complicity by France and the National Railroad in facilitating the journey of Jews via the trains from France and locations in France to the extermination camps, to Auschwitz and other places, thousands upon thousands of Jews. And I said, what a fascinating story. I want to learn about this. I didn't know about it. So I started listening to this podcast. And about 10 minutes into it, I hear this voice. And I say, wait a second. And this is the voice of a survivor. And I say, wait a minute, I know this voice. I know this voice. I know it as well as I know my dad's voice. And I realized it was the voice that I heard at every family function I ever attended. And that is the voice of Leo Bretholz, whose voice you will also hear, I think, during today's presentation. And Leo and my father both escaped from Vienna. My father escaped on a Kindertransport, a children's train, and Leo escaped by manually, with a friend, pulling apart the bars of one of these trains while he was on his way to Auschwitz. You have a photo, and after they escaped and arrived in the United States, they became lifelong friends in Baltimore, lifelong till the end. Best man at each other's weddings, and there you see Leo at the center with the carnation next to Flo, his wife, and the fellow with the military uniform is my father, Herbert Friedman. there they are together much later in life with Leo with the tie on. And so I was quite struck. I listened to the remainder of the podcast. It's a great podcast. I think it's 5 or so episodes. I urge you all to listen to it following this if you can. But I immediately reached out to Rafi Prober, who our speaker, who plays a very prominent role in all of these events you're going to hear about as the lawyer, the principal lawyer. And I started my campaign to get him to do a CLE out in Seattle. I thought the legal community here would appreciate it. And he agreed to do so. It's not this Leo connection that is so compelling to me. What you're going to hear, it exemplifies how just one person, one lawyer, can make such a difference in society. I mean, Rafi, this young lawyer from his law firm in DC, I don't think it's an overstatement to say he forced the French government to its knees, and acknowledging responsibility here by showing leadership, commitment, creativity, and most of all, a compelling sense of justice. And that's a takeaway for all of us as lawyers. When we see injustice, never think that you couldn't make a difference, because you always can. With all that said, I want to introduce Rafi. Rafi is a legal partner in Washington, D.C. at the prestigious law firm Akin Gump. His practice is congressional investigations in D.C., so I'm sure he's busy, as well as all types of government investigations. Prior to coming to Akin Gump, Rafi was the Associate Deputy Attorney General of the Department of Justice, which is a very high post at the Department of Justice during the Obama administration. And so we're very grateful that he is with us today. So on behalf of the legal community, Rafi, I want to welcome you to Seattle.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Ron. I really appreciate the introduction, and also the small world nature of it. It's really incredible. Ron and I have been trading photos of Leo and his father, and it's truly incredible how small and wonderful in a lot of ways the world is. So thank you, Ron, and thanks to everyone for hosting me for this discussion, and to all those who are participating. As Ron said, my name's Rafi Prober. I had the really good fortune and good luck to be involved in a case that would certainly change my life, and in a lot of ways change the view of France, the history of France's role during the Holocaust, which I will talk about today, and how that came to be. We've got a slide deck because this is a CLE, so we of course have to have a slide deck, which should be coming up momentarily. And I will step through, we could go maybe 2 slides ahead. I will step through today the background on the case, the factual background, the timeline of the litigation and legislative history, the strategy, both on the Hill and, on the legislative front, and then also at the state level. There was a large state strategy involved. It involved a lot of elements of communications and public relations, public affairs. Ultimately, at the end of the undertaking, State Department-led negotiations between us and the French government, and a lot of broader considerations and things that have spun out as a result of this case. So if we can go to the next slide, I'll just tell you a little bit about my background. And here is Leo, who Ron was referring to. I actually, I was, as Ron said, a fairly junior lawyer at Akin at the time. This was in 2008. My mentor, Steve Ross, who had hired me into the firm, knew that I had had a fair amount of my family killed in the Holocaust. My mom's family was from Lithuania, and her grandfather and his youngest sister were the only 2 who made it out. Everyone else was killed. And Steve walked into my office with a red well and said, we've got this case. It really seems like it's an uphill battle and not going anywhere. It's a complicated litigation with foreign sovereign immunity challenges. but there's legislation that's been introduced and we're going to try to solve it that way, but it's really hard to gain traction. Are you interested? And he dropped it on my desk. I started reading the papers. Leo wrote a book called Leap into Darkness, which I would suggest it's really worth the read. It's an incredible story of his experience on the run for 7 years during the war, including, as we'll talk about and hear from Leo, in his own words shortly, jumping from a moving train bound for Auschwitz. And, I read the complaint, I read the related papers, but it wasn't until I read Leo's book that it grabbed me. And I think we've all had those moments in life, whether, sitting in the office or elsewhere, where something just jumps off the page or grabs you, and you know that it's not going to let go, until you get to the end, whatever that may be. And that was the experience I had after I read Leo's book. I just knew that I needed to do something with this. And then I got to meet Leo. We became very, very close. He ended up passing away in 2014, in March of 2014, which I'll get to because it's very relevant for the story. And actually ultimately the negotiations with the State Department, which were ongoing at the time. And when he passed away, it had a very meaningful impact on the case and the trajectory, in addition to, of course, losing him. But I became so invested in this case that, the firm threw all the resources that were needed at it. And at the height of this case, I was billing north of 1,000 hours a year to this pro bono matter, which was really, I don't think I appreciated it as much at the time. It was before I had made partner, so I didn't fully appreciate what that meant. But now in retrospect, it makes me even prouder, of the place that I'm practicing law and of what they put into this. We had over 50 different lawyers and timekeepers billing time to the pro bono matter. And it really just was an incredible firm-wide undertaking across many, many offices, which I'll talk about shortly. If we can go to the next slide, please. So this provides a good amount of the factual background. This is the first few minutes of the podcast. So if you'll indulge me, I'd like to play this. And the photo is of me and Leo and Rosette Goldstein, who also is a character in the podcast. She was a hidden child in France, was one of the survivors we represented. And this was taken shortly after a Senate Judiciary Committee hearing in 2012. So if we can play the clip now, please.
I'm Matthew Slutsky, and this is Covering Their Tracks, the extraordinary story of the SNCF's denial of its history and how storytelling can be used to confront the past and achieve justice.
During World War II, France's state-run railway known as SNCF transported thousands of Jews to their deaths in Nazi prison camps.
We have memories that haunt us and will haunt us to our dying day.
They were paid per head per kilometer to transport people, human beings.
You must try to get off the train so somebody will remember, somebody will tell the story of what happened to us.
I'm announcing my administration's efforts to transform travel in America with an historic investment in high-speed rail.
SNCF has never accepted moral or financial responsibility for its actions. And until it does so, it should not be permitted to get taxpayer money.
70 years is far too long to wait for a company to accept responsibility for the death and suffering it caused.
Those are the voices of Holocaust survivors, newscasters, lawyers, Senator Joe Lieberman, and President Barack Obama. They're all talking about trains, and that's the story that brings us here. Today, the French National Railroad, known as SNCF, exists as a pinnacle of train travel, a Fortune 500 company. During World War II, however, the railway was complicit in the Holocaust, transporting approximately 76,000 French Jews, in addition to countless others, including American POWs, toward Nazi concentration camps around Europe. Over the next 5 episodes, you'll hear about the clash of business, law, government, corporate and moral accountability, and of a diplomatic crisis that would go to the highest levels of the US and French governments. One man would even manage to leap from one of these trains speeding towards Auschwitz, and he would ultimately tell the world his story. But to set the table, we're going to start in post-war France.
Thanks very much. If we can go to the next slide. So I know there's a lot of content on this slide. If folks want to just glance at it, I will walk through many of these events during the course of today's discussion, but this is just to give you a sense of some of the key markers and developments in the case. The Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act, which is central to the case and how it proceeded, was passed in '76. In 2004, there was an unrelated case. Altman decided, effectively kicking us out of court. In '05 and '06 was the beginning of the federal effort to introduce legislation that would provide basically a narrow carve-out to allow this case to proceed. In 2009, after President Obama announced about $100 billion in high-speed rail, primarily in California, Florida, a few other places, we launched a state campaign, which I will talk about. First in California, as you'll see here, there was a little bit more engagement from SNCF, their first formal apology in 2011. There were Maryland Senate and House hearings in 2011, and then again in 2014 in a subsequent piece of legislation that was introduced. There were also House and U.S. Congress, House and Senate hearings that were held as well. And ultimately, a December 8th, 2014 ceremony in the treaty room at the U.S. State Department, where France and the U.S. agreed to a historic and very improbable settlement, where France provided $60 million paid entirely to the Holocaust survivors, no legal fees or anything else, 100% to be distributed by the U.S. to the survivors. So I'll talk through all of this as we go, but I just wanted to give sense of folks a sense of timing here. There's so many different efforts that really overlapped in a lot of ways at the state and federal level. So hopefully this gives people an appreciation for what was moving and when. And I should mention, we're going to try to leave about 15 minutes at the end to take any questions that are out there. So I know folks are dropping questions in the chat, and please feel free to do so. Happy to address any questions as people have them. If we could go to the next slide. So let's talk about the litigation at the outset. The initial complaint was the Abrams complaint, alleging that SNCF, which was a separate corporate entity, remained independent during World War II, operated the deportation trains for a profit as an ordinary commercial transaction. SNCF actually billed per head and per kilometer for the deportations. And a common refrain during the case that we heard and during the legislative efforts that we heard from SNCF and their representatives was essentially they were forced to do so. They had no choice. It's obviously a defense all of us have heard, and it's not particularly persuasive. One of the most pivotal pieces of evidence, which I'll show you a copy of in a bit, was actually a bill that SNCF sent after the liberation of Paris to the de Gaulle government looking to be reimbursed for services rendered, which really undercuts the notion that they had a gun to their heads. But all of these factual issues came into play both in the litigation and then subsequently in the legislative hearings at the state and the federal level. SNCF remained under French civilian control throughout World War II and is alleged to have collaborated willingly with the German Nazi regime. SNCF moved to dismiss the lawsuit on a claim of sovereign immunity. As I showed you a slide ago, sovereign immunity was passed in 1976. It's a creation of Congress. And even though SNCF is one of the 50 or 500 largest corporations in the world, earning hundreds of millions of dollars from its commercial activities in the US, and it is not accorded sovereign immunity in France, it is subject, and if we can go to the next slide, it is subject to sovereign immunity in the United States. And in the category of what Ron was saying, just coincidences and paths crossing, this is really, something that you can't make up. In an unrelated but Holocaust-related case, Republic of Austria v. Altman in 2004, the Supreme Court decided that foreign sovereign immunity was retroactive in nature, so reaching back prior to the passage of the act in 1976. And if anyone has seen the movie The Woman in Gold with the Klimt painting, that's what this case was. That's what this case was about. And for purposes of that case, Maria Altman qualified under an exception to the Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act. The act applied pre-1976 to the conduct during the war, and they got the painting back. She got her painting back. It was a terrific result. It had the unintended consequence of knocking us out of court. We did not qualify under an exception to foreign sovereign immunity. So again, you really sort of can't make this stuff up, but it was the Altman case related to Holocaust art that knocked us out of court. And that's what necessitated some sort of legislative solution. And as you'll see here, the Second Circuit was very clear about it, including then Judge Sotomayor, who wrote for the court that, quote, the railroad's conduct at the time lives on in infamy, but the court concluded that the evil actions of the French National Railroad's former private masters in knowingly transporting thousands to death camps during World War II are not susceptible to legal redress in federal court today. And that one sentence is what gave birth to the federal legislation, because it was unacceptable to the survivors, to their advocates, and frankly, to anyone who encountered the facts of this case, that there wasn't some mechanism for redress for these Holocaust survivors and their families who had gone through the worst thing imaginable, that there was no redress in the United States in any fashion or in France. So if we can go to the next slide, please. So this is just a copy of the legislation that was introduced, which again essentially carved out the Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act. And I will embarrass one of the, although she shouldn't be embarrassed because she performed an amazing feat, which really helped to bring us here today. But one of the participants, I understand, is Rachel Yamini from the U.S. Attorney's Office, who has joined, who is fantastic. And when this bill was initially introduced on the Senate side, she subsequently came on board as a younger staffer for Senator Schumer, and this fell on her desk. And it was Rachel and me figuring out a lot of this when no one else was pushing and before this really caught fire. The Senate bill, when it was introduced, was S-634. Rachel said, we really should have a name. Shouldn't this be the Holocaust Rail Justice Act, which is what it became. And I don't think anyone in Senator Schumer's office at the time thought that this had a chance of passage or even moving forward or getting to the point of a hearing, and certainly not prompting an international settlement. But Rachel didn't believe that. And she and I locked arms and spent a lot of time trying to push this every which way, gather co-sponsors, and to push this boulder uphill. So I haven't talked to Rachel in many years. I know she's on the CLE Zoom, but I just wanted to publicly express my gratitude for the role that she played and how pivotal she was in this moving forward. So we have the federal legislation. We can go to the next slide. As I was just mentioning, it really was pushing a boulder uphill. There was no outside forcing mechanism. We had lots of great meetings with many members of Congress and senior staff who said, this is a terrific issue. We're really supportive. They would meet Leo, they would hear Leo's story, which we'll hear in a moment, of him jumping from a moving train bound for Auschwitz. And, you would leave these meetings and I felt like we couldn't lose. This was going to happen. We had these meetings, everyone's crying. And then it gets to the brass tacks of, well, if we carve out foreign sovereign immunity here, what about other cases? What does this do, to the relationship, the bilateral relationship with France? Where is the State Department on this? Which, by the way, the State Department was wildly opposed to our efforts. There were other Holocaust agreements that had actually been litigated all the way up to the Supreme Court, and there were reparations plans in place for those that were being challenged. It was called I-Check. It's the insurance settlements. SNCF launched a massive lobbying campaign, and we really were up against a behemoth, and despite having really good meetings, we were getting little to no traction whatsoever. We would peel off a co-sponsor here, a co-sponsor there. Joe Lieberman actually was one of our first co-sponsors, and he and his staff were incredible. His wife, Hadassah, was born in a DP camp. Her parents were survivors, and she got to know Leo very well through this case, and she was pivotal too. And ultimately, once the high-speed rail piece of it began, which I'll talk about in more detail shortly, we ended up being able to elevate the profile on this. And we, at the height, we had 50 plus co-sponsors in the House, 20 plus co-sponsors in the Senate, bipartisan, including at the time Majority Leader Reid. We had a Senate Judiciary Committee hearing, we had a House Foreign Affairs Committee hearing, and this thing really caught fire. And that should have been the case even without the economic interest, but that was the thing, and the state strategy was the thing that catalyzed this and allowed us to tell the story. And at the end of the day, as Ron said, I'm obviously intimately involved with the case and the podcast, and it's in my blood now. But it really is an incredible story. I'd encourage you to listen, because it all comes down to the story and the survivors and hearing from them. And once you hear it, and once you're able to get it out there and get press and have testimony on the record and have letters sent, it just started to snowball. And that's what ended up happening with the federal legislation, which would have provided a day in court for SNCF's survivors to sue the US's oldest ally, which would have been an interesting outcome, and one that many important constituencies were hoping to avoid. So we'll get to that more shortly, but why don't we go to the next slide quickly? And if we can play this is Leo's testimony in front of the House Foreign Affairs Committee in November of 2011. This is the first time ever that the US Congress was hearing testimony on SNCF's role during the Holocaust. And subsequent to this, I've heard from a number of members of Congress who said this was the most moving testimony they've heard in their time in Congress. So if we can play the clip, please.
SNCF deported 76,000 Jews on those trains, including over 11,000 children. They would count us off, 50 into each cattle car. In the car in front of me, a family was counted off, and the 51st person was a young son. The boy began to scream, and the father pleaded to allow them to stay together, but with cold precision, the boy was shoved into one car, his family into another. I believe that was the last time they saw each other. For the entire journey, SNCF provided was one piece of triangle cheese, one stale piece of bread, and no water. There was hardly room to stand or sit or squat in the cattle car. There was one bucket for us to relieve ourselves. Within that cattle car, people were sitting and standing and praying and weeping, fighting the whole gamut of human emotions. My friend Manfred and I began to try to escape. Many in the cattle car, fearing the guards would punish everyone if we were found out, urged us not to even try. I also was beginning to doubt our plan when an elderly woman on crutches spoke out. She wielded that crutch like a weapon, pointed it at me and said, "You must do it. If you get out," she said, "maybe you can tell the story. Who else will tell the story?" I can still see her face and hear her voice today. Manfred and I set out to pry apart the bars on the windows. First we tried belts, they slipped off. Then someone suggested we dip our sweaters into the human waste on the bottom of the car. We kept twisting the wet sweaters tighter and tighter like a tourniquet. The human waste dripped down our arms. We kept going for hours until finally there was just enough room for us to squeeze through. It was night. I went first, and Manfred helped me climb out the tiny window, stand on the small ledge on the outside of the car. He followed me, and we held on tight so as not to slip and fall beneath the train, and waited for it to take a curve and slow down. Then we jumped to our freedom. Of the 1,000 people with me on the SNCF convoy number 42, only 5 survived the war. If I had not jumped from that train, I wouldn't be here today. It is my duty to speak for those who did not survive, such as the old woman who emboldened us to escape, and for my family that did not survive.
Great, thank you. And if we can go to the next slide, please. So I got to know Leo really well, which was an incredible treasure. I'm sure everyone can appreciate having heard just that few minutes of testimony from him. He was an incredible human being. Ron knows this well, having grown up with him. He was not bitter somehow, but had a very firm belief that justice needed to be done here. And the most important thing for Leo was an apology. And I can still hear him in his words saying that he wanted a clear statement of contrition, an apology that we did something really wrong. And this was an interesting element of the case. It was obviously a monetary settlement in the end, and a very, very forceful apology that would come years later from President Macron, and a recognition of the role that France played in the deportations. But a lot of the survivors had a lot of different objectives and views, and some didn't want to be involved. For some, the money was critically important. There were survivors who were able to afford around-the-clock care in their final years by virtue of the settlement. And then there were those who really wanted an apology and to make sure that the history books would be accurate and that the role the railway and France played during the war would be accurately portrayed. And Leo was in that camp, and he really became the face of the movement over a number of years. About 6 years, Leo was the face of the movement. And even after his wife, Flo, who Ron mentioned, passed away, during this case, Leo rallied and he said, I feel like it's my obligation, it's my duty for those who can't be here, for my mother, for my sisters. And even when I could tell he was tired and was slowing down, he really mustered every ounce of strength he had to continue telling the story, which frankly has given me a lot of hope and inspiration over the last number of months, which I know have been pretty dark for a lot of us. So if we can go to the next slide, please. So on the state strategy, I've touched on this, but I'll tell you a little bit more. Obama announced high-speed rail plans. I actually got a Google alert, which, pre-Twitter, pre-everything else, sitting at my desk. I had an alert set up for SNCF that SNCF was pursuing high-speed rail. They had submitted a 1,000-page proposal to the Federal Railroad Administration. This was in 2009, and it was the same exact corporate entity in 2009 as it was in during the war, and they were pursuing taxpayer dollars in California and Florida and Maryland through a majority-owned joint venture. And for some of the tax dollars, it was going to be coming from survivors or family members of those who were deported. And at this time, there had been no apology, there had been no settlement, there had been no recognition of the role that SNCF itself, the company, played during the war. And we were actually having a meeting with one of the senior House members, his staff, Mr. Berman, on the House Foreign Affairs Committee. And one of his staffers said, have you thought about talking to Bob Blumenfield? He used to be our legislative director. He's now a member of the California Assembly. I bet he'd be really interested in this. And we did exactly that. Assemblymember Blumenfield introduced AB 619, which was essentially a disclosure statute, which said, it was 3 check boxes as they were putting out the procurement for high-speed rail. Did you deport anyone during the war? Have you opened your archives? And have you paid reparations? Those were the questions. We thought foolishly that would be enough to sort of shame SNCF into hopefully doing the right thing and coming to the table in addressing this and their role in the deportations and reaching some resolution with the survivors. I think we greatly underestimated at the time what this would put into motion and what SNCF would do. But just to give you a sense of our thinking, that really was the initial cudgel. This was going to be the opening salvo, hoping that they would address this and move on. What ended up happening, unfortunately, both for the passage of time and the survivors who we lost in the intervening period, but also for the company, frankly, because it didn't need to be this difficult, they provided what I would describe now as a Harvard Business School case study on how not to handle a crisis situation. They had a high-speed rail website. I forget the exact name. It was like SNCF High Speed Rail or SNCF America High Speed Rail, where much of the content for the first number of months when this thing was launched was about the Holocaust and their role in the Holocaust. It was a myth versus fact. A lot of it was untrue. They misrepresented a lot of the history, and they launched an aggressive lobbying campaign against the survivors. At the height, they were spending north of $1 million lobbying against the survivors. They ran ads in local papers in Maryland, in Leo's home area, suggesting that there were reparations programs available that were not available. There are French reparations programs available, but not that cover folks who are not in France, who are not French citizens. So it was unfortunate. It was really underhanded, and it required us, as I say in the podcast, to take the gloves off. And that's, ultimately that's what ended up happening. So I'd like to play just a short clip to hear from the perspective of a state legislator, sort of why this case mattered at the state level, and then we'll talk a little bit about how this catalyzed efforts on the national level.
I remember there was a person who was a Holocaust survivor who would literally have this new railroad going through practically his backyard. And the thought of that was just unconscionable to me.
That's former California State Assembly member Bob Blumenfield.
Especially as I learned more and more about SNCF's role and their failure to take responsibility for that role. I started asking the question, why have they never been held accountable?
Okay, thanks very much. And if we can go to the next slide, we'll talk a little bit. There we are. We'll talk a little bit about Maryland. So Maryland was Leo's home. The survivor who Bob Blumenfield was referring to was actually Leo. So in March of 2011, we end up with hearings in Annapolis, in the Maryland House and Senate, in the most improbable of places for a showdown on the national stage of the role of France during the Holocaust. What ended up happening in the backstory is really incredible. There was a company, which I believe is a majority-owned joint venture called Keolis, which is a Maryland-based company that was bidding for contracts. At the time, I believe they were planning to send their CEO to testify and on this issue, on the legislation in Maryland, which would have required disclosure, basically saying if you want to bid for this contract, the MARC rail contract for travel between Baltimore and DC, you have to have opened your archives and made them publicly available. The company decided that they wanted to push the hearing. They weren't going to be prepared for it. And the state legislator, Sandy Rosenberg, who was the lead sponsor, said, okay, well, we'll push the hearing, but only on the condition that the CEO of SNCF America, a gentleman by the name of Dennis Dutay, appear and give testimony. And I will tell you, Maryland did not, I don't think they do now, have subpoena authority. I don't think they had a mechanism to compel him to be there. But he showed up and they pushed the hearing. And it was the first time where the survivors were actually able to confront SNCF. And it was covered nationally, internationally. And again, I say it's the most improbable of places, because who would have thought that Annapolis, Maryland would lead to this showdown where you had state legislators, holding up historical records from the Holocaust, grilling the CEO of SNCF. And Leo told his story, other survivors told their stories, and the legislation sailed forward. It was signed into law by the governor. SNCF, subsequent to the passage of the legislation, put out a press release explaining that in I'm paraphrasing, but very loosely, in a new age of transparency, they were going to be donating their archives to the Shoah Memorial in France, Yad Vashem, and the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, which again is a great result. They failed to mention that it was only because of the Maryland legislation, but that's fine. Ultimately, in 2012, Maryland awarded the contract to Bombardier over SNCF. As this is unfolding, think about the federal legislation, catching fire. We had the House Foreign Affairs hearing in November of 2011. There is a Senate Judiciary Committee hearing in the summer of 2012. Again, big thanks to Rachel Yamini on that front. So all of this is pushing. There's multiple different inputs here. It's the state level, it's the federal, it's the survivors telling their story. In parallel, there's the communications campaign, which I'll talk about briefly. And as this is kicking up toward the end of 2012, I actually got a call at my desk from a gentleman who said, this is Ambassador Stuart Eisenstadt. I've been brought in by the US government on behalf of the State Department to try to resolve this issue. And as Ron said, I was at that point a 6th or a 7th year associate, and had to pretend like I'd been sitting there waiting for this call from Ambassador Eisenstadt and that I knew what to do with it. But really it was just a reflection of the amount of noise that we had been able to make on the different fronts. And I think ultimately SNCF's and France's recognition that this was all impacting their ability to enter and meaningfully compete in the US market, and that this was an open issue that had to be addressed. So all of these things are going on at the same time. We have state hearings, we have the federal legislation, which is sailing forward, which is causing a whole lot of agita for the State Department because it's creating the very real possibility that France might be susceptible to suit in US courts for their role during the war. So there's all these different levers that we're pulling to try to move this thing forward. I don't know that any of us fully appreciated at the time what exactly the resolution would look like, but it was all these different levers pushing sort of towards justice, loosely described, which we'll talk about in a bit what that looked like. So why don't we play a quick clip of SNCF America's president, Dennis Dutay, from the 2011 hearing.
The state of Maryland does not need to impose a law on SNCF or on Keolis to discuss these issues with us. We are here to discuss them with you.
Then the state delegates began to ask their questions. Here's Delegate Peter F. Murphy.
I thought I heard earlier in testimony that you claim that you were coerced. But it doesn't really connect with me that if you were coerced, that the German Nazis would then also pay you. It would seem if you were coerced, they would have no incentive.
The fact that SNCF was coerced is evidenced by a number of historical documents, the best known of which is the order which was put in each and every office just 1 month after the Armistice Agreement in July 1940, and which said to all the employees that if they did not comply, they would go to German courts where the standard penalty was death, not only for themselves, but for all their families.
Delegate Jocelyn Pena-Melnick was next.
Well, we have an invoice in the record that was provided today that my colleague, Delegate Hauer, referenced to a second ago. So there is actually proof that the company was reimbursed for transportation. So my question is, that is obviously not the only one. Are there any others?
There is no other that we know of.
May I ask the historian, please? You are the historian, correct?
Yeah.
In your documents, do you have any other invoices for transportation?
Sure.
How or what?
I don't know. We don't know because we have only a part, the real part of the archives. And
let me break down the question.
Yeah.
Okay. The gentleman to your right, the president just stated that to his knowledge, there's no invoices are being paid. We have evidence that contradicts that. I just asked you and you stated that indeed there's some. I would like to know, since you are the historian, right? How many other invoices like the one we have in our record do you possess in your custody? How many other do you possess?
We don't have, but you have to know that you have all the archives in France are open, and you have a lot of archives in different places in France and different administration.
Great, thank you. If we can go to the next slide. So I've touched on this. I'll just explain a few other points. So a lot of this really centered on communications, telling the story. Public relations strategy, I think it sounds a little trite, but getting the survivors' stories out there and giving them a platform to be heard is what was moving the needle, whether that was in Congress or at the state level. There was a change.org petition, which actually Leo was the sponsor of, calling for justice and ultimately, reparations and an apology from SNCF. And this was toward the end of the campaign, toward the end of Leo's life, actually. And it was, I'm laughing and smiling because I have vivid recollections of talking to him about a Twitter handle and what that meant, and a change.org petition and what that meant. And, I recall after the petition launched, I called him and I said, Leo, the petition just went out. They sent it out to a whole bunch of people. Lots of folks are starting to sign up. What do you think would be success? How many people do you think, what's your guess? How many people have seen this and signed it? And he said, I don't know, 30, maybe 40. And I said, well, it just was launched yesterday. What if I told you that 60,000 people around the world have already signed it? And he was speechless. And as Ron knows, knowing Leo well, he was rarely speechless, but he just didn't have the words. And, after a bit of silence, he said, you're telling me that 60,000 people read my story and know my story and listened enough and wanted to sign this to support us. I can't believe it. Ultimately, about 160,000 people signed the change.org petition. Leo had a Twitter handle. He was tweeting at Governor O'Malley and others. We had a Gmail set up for him, and it was great. He learned a lot about social media. We did as well, but he was always in to make some good trouble, and it was a real privilege to do so together. Another point, and I touched on this talking about the sort of Harvard Business School case study and how not to address a crisis situation. SNCF made a lot of missteps during the course of this campaign, which we actually were able to capitalize on and use some of those missteps to raise the profile and to get the story out there in a bigger way. So, one example is they were donating money to a Holocaust education initiative in Florida. And my understanding is under Florida law, Holocaust education is mandated in K through 12, I believe. And they had donated to this center or this organization that was overseeing the curriculum and the education. And under the terms of the agreement, there was a question as to whether SNCF might actually have some imprint and be able to impact the content of the materials and what was being taught in the schools, which of course was unconscionable to the survivors we represented and their family members who couldn't believe that, this company would have some role in determining what their grandkids and great-grandchildren might be learning in schools. So we very quickly got a majority of the Florida Congressional delegation, both U.S. senators, a majority of the members of Congress, to send a letter to the Secretary of Education in Florida, who I think had been on the job for like a week or two. I mean, this poor guy, to get that letter landing on your desk, you can imagine having probably no background in this program or the donation, but Florida very quickly and very publicly returned the money and would not partner with SNCF on this at the time. And you can imagine it kicked up a lot of press and really got us more attention and not less. The cease and desist letter is very interesting. I didn't think that there would be an IP component to this case, but in fact there was. I had a lot of survivors and family members sending in their original letters and artifacts, and I just didn't know what to do with this stuff. So we found, it was actually my mom's best friend's son, who was a web developer who was living at home in the basement. So I knew that I could, lean on my mom, to lean on Raina, to lean on Noah, to get him to help us out on this pro bono case, which he did very happily and willingly. So we built a website, and we used it as a repository for the stories, the developments in the case, letters, legislative updates, things like that. And we registered a bunch of different domains as we were contemplating what to call this thing. It ended up being the Coalition for Holocaust Rail Justice, but we registered a number of different domains. And one of those that we registered, I think it was SNCF Survivors Speak, or was something that used, the corporate name SNCF. And we actually got a cease and desist letter that was sent, saying that we were, inappropriately using their intellectual property, threatening a suit. And of course, as a sixth-year associate, I was pretty sure it was a bad development that I was going to get our law firm sued. And as I sat down and talked this through with the senior partner, who was overseeing the case but really letting me run with it, he said, "Are you kidding? This is gold. They're threatening to sue the survivors in U.S. court for telling their stories, but saying that they are immune from suit in the U.S. courts." So we ended up being able to hand this to a reporter at the Washington Post, who ran a big story on this, and very kindly included a link to the website that launched through that article. So to say we made lemonade is probably an understatement, but it really was an interesting experience of some of the missteps, in my estimation, in terms of dealing with this, and how we took advantage of that to the benefit of the survivors, and in an effort to get the stories out there more. If we can go to the next slide. So this I referenced earlier. This is a copy of the bill, an invoice, and we can go to the next slide. But this ended up being a very powerful piece of evidence that was distributed in Hill meetings and at hearings, and was really quite compelling that the company was seeking reimbursement for services rendered after the Nazis were gone, after the liberation of Paris. And if we can go to the next slide, please. Okay, I will paraphrase and just do a little voiceover on this in the interest of time, and wanting to make sure we wrap right on the hour so we have time for questions. But this was the first state visit that President Obama hosted, was President Hollande from France. And we managed to get Brianna Keilar, who was then the CNN White House correspondent, interested enough that she asked Jay Carney a question at the briefing as to, this issue in Maryland. Was this something that President Obama was planning to raise with President Hollande? And you could tell that he had absolutely no idea whatsoever what she was talking about. But that was sort of the point. We had gotten it to the level that it was getting this kind of interest, that at the White House press briefing surrounding the state visit, this was being raised. And, these were the moments where it sort of felt like this is coming together. And, somehow we're getting this toward the finish line, whatever that ended up looking like. So if we can go to the next slide, please. So I often describe this as sort of three-dimensional chess, and I talked a little bit about the State Department negotiations and the parallel efforts. So we can move past this slide, but really all of these different inputs were at play in moving the case forward. So the State Department negotiations lasted almost 2 years. This is a photo from the December signing in the treaty room, as I mentioned, between the US and France. That's Ambassador Eisenstadt. Some of the stickier issues that had to be resolved were solving for the passage of time. There were French programs that were established very shortly after the war, but didn't cover non-French citizens or folks outside of France. And the US and we were very focused on making sure that France and SNCF were not rewarded for dragging their time and the passage of time and the number of survivors who passed away. The agreement ultimately was imperfect in many, many ways. There have been no prior Holocaust agreements that covered heirs. So we were left in the very difficult position of figuring out how to make this palatable enough. many survivors were not, or the family members were not able to recover those who perished. So if a mother and a father both perished in Auschwitz, their descendants, if there were any, would not be able to recover under the program. It required that at least one parent survived, and then essentially someone could stand in the claim, in the shoes of that claim. And even that was a hard-fought issue because the French program doesn't provide for that. And of course, the French program began in the late 40s, so it didn't have that as an impediment, whereas, you know, almost 70 years had passed by the time the U.S. program, by the time this agreement was signed and the program was stood up, and so many survivors had passed away in the interim. And that was just a bright line for us. We said there cannot be an agreement if we cannot have people standing in the shoes of a claim. And that was really sort of a novel concept that we came up with the State Department. But once Leo passed away, he passed away in March of 2014, and the agreement was signed in December of 2014. And, you know, I think the light bulb went off for everyone, and they said, hold on a second, you know, Leo died in his 90s, having fought for decades for justice. It cannot be the case that his family can't recover anything and that they can't stand in their shoes. And ultimately that tipped the scale and allowed the agreement to move forward. You know, from a risk perspective, I think the U.S. Concern was chipping away at foreign sovereign immunity, which is why doing this by agreement was much better from U.S. perspective than opening up the courts. And for France, they wanted closure. So the U.S. had to make clear that they would, you know, oppose any legislation or any litigation on these subjects in the future and really have this be sort of the final word. I know that there was just a question that was put in the chat on the average size of the claim, and I'm happy to address any questions that have come in as I've been talking as well. It varied, but it went from about $50,000 to $400,000 for folks who were actually on the trains and survived over the years. So really a meaningful amount of money. And ultimately it was very special to be standing there in December of 2014, and mostly for me at least, to hear, you know, the French ambassador describe France's role during the war and to offer an apology. If we can go to the next slide, please. So this is just the agreement, the resolution itself, and some of the language from there, which we can move forward. Next slide, please. So some of the broader considerations to think about, or that I think about as we're about 10 years out from this agreement now. One is just corporate accountability, you know, which this was an interesting evolution of where the company, you know, obviously where they were during the war and then during the case to today. Other reparations efforts, the Dutch rail, I think it was 2019. It was a few years ago. I read an article someone forwarded me that said the Dutch rail had proactively entered into a settlement for its role in the Holocaust. And one of their executives was quoted as saying, and I'm paraphrasing loosely, you know, we watched the SNCF case unfold and we had no interest in doing that, which was really gratifying to know that this was continuing to have an impact in other arenas and for other deserving victims as well. Obviously, France's recognition of its role in the Holocaust, for me at least personally, is probably the most meaningful thing, and just knowing that my kids and their kids are going to learn, we hope, the actual history. And we'll play a quote in a minute that touches on this. And then again, you know, the terrifying rise in anti-Semitism that we're seeing and experiencing. We were wrapping up production of this podcast as October 7th happened. And in episode 5, it talks about rising anti-Semitism in the US and in France, and all of this was in there already. You know, Biden had already launched the first ever initiative to combat anti-Semitism. You know, October 7th, unfortunately, just provided a stark reminder of how dangerous this remains and how relevant this remains. And you know, after the 7th, I've told this story elsewhere, that, you know, the podcast, I had all of the sort of rough cuts of the episodes, and you know, I was sort of shell-shocked, like I'm sure so many of us were. And all I could do was listen to the podcast, to the tape over and over and over again of all the episodes, because it was comforting to hear familiar voices. And it really helped to think about people who've gone through times as unimaginable as it is, that were worse than today. And again, it's unimaginable. And it feels wrong to say that, but they were harder, and they got through, and they told the story, and it provided, at least for me, a bit of a glimmer of hope. And I spoke with Rosette Goldstein, who I mentioned was the hidden child in France, one of the survivors, and also the narrator of the program. And both of them independently had been doing the exact same thing, just listening to the tape over and over in those, days and weeks after October 7th. So my hope is that, this story, the story of this pursuit of justice, it's not just about this case. And I hope that this, really will help to, renew calls for justice and make sure that everyone is focused on doing everything we all can to preserve the history and root out anti-Semitism, wherever and whenever we see it. If we can go to the next slide, please. So if folks want to just read this quickly, this to me was, if you ask sort of what do I think of 10 years out from the case, what is the most consequential outcome of the case? It is the 2017 Macron speech that you see here, which is the most forceful, full-throated apology and ownership of France's role during the Holocaust that any French official or president has ever offered. And truly, I mentioned earlier that all Leo wanted was a clear statement of contrition that we did something wrong. And in July of 2017, on the anniversary of the Veldiv roundup, that's exactly what President Macron delivered. If we can go to the next slide, I'd like to play just quickly a clip from episode 5. An incredible guy, Sylvain Fort, he actually wrote that speech for President Macron. And I think this really captures why we wanted to make this podcast, why we wanted to tell the story, and how important it is for this story and so many others not to forget and to keep retelling them. So let's play the clip, please.
Too many people think that the recognition of the historical mistakes that we have made as a country, as a government, as people, weakens the country, I do think exactly the contrary.
That's Sylvain Fort. He was the head of communication for Macron's 2017 election, and he wrote Macron's speech.
How many trials you have where people have lost a daughter or a child or something that's been murdered. The only thing that they want is the murderer to admit it. It's exactly the same for a country. You weaken a country where you don't recognize your crimes. You weaken your society, and you weaken your culture, and you weaken your very identity. So this speech is also a message to the new generation saying, look, maybe you would think at some point that you don't have racist or anti-Semitic ministers, that your government is not like that. You're not like that. But please be careful. You have to detect and to feel and to be aware that many, many signs, many signals in the society, in the culture, make this present. And what happened in 40 to 45 in France was not just, unfortunate. It was also rooted in the very culture of many, many parts of our intellectual landscape, political landscape, theoretical landscape.
Thanks very much. So, Alana, happy to answer any questions if folks have any.
Great. Thank you so much, Rafi, for that presentation. And what a powerful way to end with Macron's speech as well. And just his very clear recognition of the wrong that was done. There are a number of questions that have come in. And since we just heard Macron's speech, I want to start with this one that came in early on in your presentation, and you addressed it somewhat, so maybe you can expand on it a little bit. The audience member writes, can you please address the myth of French resistance in the context of this significant case?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I'm not sure. I'm certainly not a historian. I didn't even play one in this case. I'm not sure I'm best suited to address it. But what I can tell you is there really was, what you always hear people say is everyone was in the resistance, but there really was a very difficult challenge of dealing with the societal issues. And it felt a lot like, as this case was moving forward, and we were part of it. I mean, I think we were pushing, but there were other things happening. If anyone has seen the movie La Rafle, it's the roundup of the story of the Veldiv roundup. The movie Sarah's Key came out, which was in the book, of course, which was about this. There was a real feeling that grandchildren were asking, what did my parents really do? What did my grandparents really do during the war? And I think we were a part of that. So, I'm not sure that I could explain sort of the myth of French resistance, but it's a real thing. I mean, this is covered in the podcast, but shortly after the war, SNCF actually put out a movie recasting their role, where the trains never reached the destination. Obviously, that's not how the real story ended, unfortunately. So there was a large element of that, and I think as we were sort of pushing this boulder uphill, that was part of the challenge. Was it was almost more psychological, than it was legal.
And Rafi, another question that came in was, are there other such cases that are in process or in the works now, or are there other such cases that you think should be tried like this one?
So as far as the French cases, not that I'm aware of. I mean, I think this really sort of addressed it. There was some follow-on litigation that some of the plaintiffs' attorneys brought, but I don't think it was successful. I'm not sure I can tell you at least sort of in, stepping back into my regular day job of being a congressional investigations defense lawyer, this really does inform a lot. And this sort of helped on the other side of it, going after a Fortune 250 company seeking justice. This really does inform a lot of how I think about cases and the multidimensional approach, in the courts, on the Hill, in state legislatures, in the press, and how all of these things go together. So, I think anytime there's an issue, sort of this consequence, or, a large corporation or large client battling over a significant issue like this, you have to sort of look at that three-dimensional chessboard and appreciate what you might be up against. So I've certainly personally used, the learnings from this experience in this case and other representations, both pro bono and on the defense side.
So, Rafi, I have one last question for you, and this is one that I actually want to ask you as related to the podcast and the case itself. In the podcast, we hear that Leo died just as the case was getting started, or during the process, and that was a really powerful point. That how would this continue without him? Can you tell us a little bit more about how you went about that?
Yeah, so Leo passed away on a Saturday at the beginning of March in 2014. He was slated to testify in Annapolis. I referred to the second round of hearings and legislation. He was slated to testify that Monday. And on Sunday, I was on the phone with Rosette Goldstein, who was the hidden child in France, and we were sort of the brain trust on this thing, me, Leo, and Rosette. And I became really close with both of them, and they were, they just loved working together on this and had, built a beautiful friendship. And Rosette and I were, telling stories about Leo and crying and, having an early Shiva of sorts, I guess. And I said, like, I don't know what to do. He's supposed to testify tomorrow. We're going to have to push the hearing. I cannot imagine a universe in which we go forward with this and what that looks like. You know, the funeral, he was buried on Tuesday. Yeah, it was like, you know, he's not even buried. We can't do this. And Rosette, it was, I say this in the podcast, it was if I had offended her, and, you know, a switch was flipped. And she said, "Are you kidding me? If Leo was alive, he would kill you if he heard you say that." And she said, "You know what? We need to finish this for him." And she lives in Florida. She said, "I'm going to get on a flight this afternoon. You're going to pick me up at the airport, and I will be there to testify in his behalf tomorrow." And that's exactly what happened. She testified. We sent out an update on the change.org petition that Rosette, you know, that Leo had passed away and that Rosette was picking up the baton. And she'd always been involved in the case, but she really picked it up and ran through the finish line and is doing so to this day. I mean, she's still speaking about the case and telling the story, and she's 85 now. She's an incredible woman. But it really was a reminder of just the grit and the determination and conviction that the survivors have. And it was certainly a good reminder for me that, you know, even in the hardest circumstances, you don't give up and keep pushing forward.
Thank you so much, Rafi, for taking the time to be on this program and for telling us about your experiences and sharing this incredible story, and most of all, for doing this work. Really, we all thank you for it.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
If you are a legal professional out there watching this show, and if you are seeking CLE credit, the link to the survey, I'm putting it in the chat right now, so you will find it there. Anyone can fill out this survey about the program, but if you are looking to get CLE credit, it's required that you fill it out, and it will ask for your name and your bar number. If you found this program interesting, please share it with other Washington state lawyers so they can also earn CLE credits. The recorded version will be posted on our website by tomorrow, and CLE credit is available also if they watch the recording through May 28th. That's the deadline. So again, link is in the survey, or sorry, the link is in the chat. Our next Lunch and Learn program, and I hope you'll come back for that, is on Tuesday, June 11th. And is going to focus on the story of one man who successfully escaped Auschwitz. In fact, he's not the only person to try to escape, and he's not even the only person to succeed. So why do we so rarely hear this side of the story? You can find out how he did it and why you likely have never heard of him on June 11th. All of this work that we do at the Holocaust Center would not be possible without the exceptional team that we have. Special thanks to Richard Green, who's running the technical side of the program today. And thank you to our entire team, Dee Simon, our CEO, Jessica Michaels, who helped to plan today's program with our legal committee, Paul Regelbrug and Brenda Anderson, Lori Worshel-Cohen, Lexi Jason, Amanda Davis, Lisa Spink, Katie Lawrence, Michael Langberg, Olivia Teague, Mario Felipe Bemonte, and Rosa Campos. Thank you also to the Conference on Material Claims Against Germany for their support of this program. And thank you to all of you for watching today. We hope to see you at a future program. This concludes the program for today. Thank you.